The lasagna had been sitting on the counter for 2 hours when my phone rang. I remember staring at it. The foil still perfectly crimped at the edges because I'd taken it out of the oven right when my husband texted me he was running late again. I'd made it from scratch, the way his mother taught me, with the bechamel and everything. I wasn't even hungry anymore. I was just sitting at the kitchen island, watching some home renovation show I wasn't actually watching, and the phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. "Is this Mrs. Whitmore?" "Yes," I said. "This is Officer Daniels with the Portland Police Department. I'm calling regarding a man who's been identified as your husband, Mr. Gregory Whitmore. He's been taken to OHSU Medical Center. Ma'am, I need you to come to the hospital as soon as possible." My first thought, and I'm almost ashamed to say this now, was that he'd been in a car accident, that he'd rear-ended someone on the 405 on his way home, that he'd been texting while driving like I'd told him 100 times not to do. "Was it a crash?" I asked. "Is he okay?" The officer paused just long enough to tell me everything. "Ma'am, please come to the hospital. Someone will speak with you when you arrive." I got there in 18 minutes. I know because I checked my phone when I pulled into the parking garage, some autopilot part of my brain logging the time like it always did. 11:47 p.m. I'd left the lasagna on the counter. I hadn't grabbed my coat. Portland in November, and I drove to the hospital in a cardigan. The ER waiting area smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. I walked up to the front desk and said my husband's name, and the woman behind the desk made a face that I will never forget. Not sad exactly, more like careful, and she picked up the phone and said something quietly, and within 2 minutes a doctor came out to meet me. That was when I noticed them. My mother-in-law was already there, sitting in the corner with my brother-in-law next to her and his wife on his other side. My mother-in-law was crying. My brother-in-law's jaw was tight. His wife was staring at her phone. I stopped walking. I looked at them. I looked at the doctor. How did they get here before me? I lived 6 minutes closer to this hospital than any of them did. The doctor guided me gently to a private room off the main corridor. One of those rooms hospitals keep for delivering the worst kind of news, with soft chairs and a box of tissues on every surface. Gregory had suffered a massive cardiac event, the doctor explained. He had been pronounced dead on arrival. He was 34 years old. He had no prior cardiac history, or at least none that we knew of. His cholesterol had been slightly elevated at his last physical, but nothing that would have predicted this. The paramedics had done everything they could. I sat very still. The doctor kept talking. I heard individual words, myocardial infarction, very sudden, no indication he suffered, but they floated past me like they were in a language I'd once studied but never really learned. "Where was he?" I finally asked. The doctor paused. "Where was my husband when this happened?" "Ma'am, the paramedics were called to a residence on S.E. Belmont. A woman at the address called 911. A woman," I said. "Yes." I nodded slowly, the kind of nod where your body is responding because your brain has temporarily vacated the premises. "What was her name?" He gave it to me. I won't repeat it here, but I'll tell you that I recognized it. I'd seen it light up my husband's phone a handful of times over the past year. He'd always explained it away so smoothly. A client, a colleague, a friend of a friend he was helping navigate a business thing. I had believed him. Or maybe I'd chosen to believe him, which isn't quite the same thing. When I walked back out to the waiting area, my mother-in-law stood up immediately and pulled me into a hug that I did not want. She was crying harder now, and I could feel her shaking against me, and I stood there with my arms at my sides because I genuinely could not make them move. My brother-in-law, his name is Dennis, and Dennis has never in 7 years of marriage acknowledged me as anything other than a useful addition to his family's financial ecosystem. Dennis put his hand on my shoulder and said, "We need to talk about arrangements." "Arrangements," I repeated. "The funeral. We need to start thinking about it. You know how these things go. Venues book up fast, especially for something like this where we'll want a proper service. Gregory deserves a proper service." I looked at him. His eyes were dry. I was 31 years old, standing in an ER hallway 40 minutes after learning my husband had died in another woman's bed, and my brother-in-law was already talking about venue availability. "Not tonight," I said. "I understand this is difficult, but Dennis—" I said his name very quietly. "Not tonight." He backed off, but I saw him exchange a look with his wife, and I filed that look away in the part of my brain that was apparently still functioning just fine. The next 3 days were a blur of casseroles I didn't ask for, relatives I barely knew filling up my living room, and my mother-in-law essentially moving herself into my guest bedroom without anyone asking if that was okay with me. My father-in-law, a quiet man who'd always been kind to me, sat in the corner of the living room and looked lost. I felt for him, genuinely. He'd lost his son. What I did not feel for was the conversation that happened on day 4. I'd just gotten off the phone with Gregory's life insurance company, which was a whole separate kind of nightmare I won't get into here. And I came downstairs to find my mother-in-law, Dennis, and Dennis's wife, Kara, sitting at my kitchen table. My kitchen table, with the same posture they'd have at a meeting they'd called. "We've been looking at funeral homes," Dennis said. "There's one in Lake Oswego that does a beautiful service. Full ceremony, reception after, really first class. It's the kind of thing Gregory would have wanted." "Okay," I said. "What's the cost?" "About $42,000, all in." I set down my coffee cup. $42,000. "For something appropriate," Kara said, with an edge to her voice I chose to ignore. "And how are you planning to pay for it?" I asked. The pause that followed was very informative. My mother-in-law leaned forward. "You have the means, sweetheart. Gregory always said you had the savings, the accounts. It wouldn't even make a dent for you, not with what you earn." There it was. Here's something I'd never told Gregory's family. Somehow bits and pieces had leaked to them over the years. I am the one who paid the bills in our marriage. Not because Gregory didn't work. He did. He had a decent job in commercial real estate, but because Gregory also spent money the way some people breathe, without apparent effort or awareness. The lease on the BMW he needed for client meetings. The golf membership. The weekend trips to Vegas with his college friends that happened 4 times a year like clockwork. I had a good job. I'm a project manager for a regional healthcare company. I make a comfortable salary. And I've been disciplined about saving since my first paycheck at 22. Gregory's money went in and went out. My money is what paid our mortgage. My money is what kept us from carrying credit card debt. My money is what funded the joint account that his family apparently knew all about. And now his family was sitting at my table telling me I should spend $42,000 on a funeral for a man who died in his girlfriend's apartment. "I'm not paying $42,000, I said. My mother-in-law's face changed. "He was your husband. I know who he was. The family expects a proper burial. People will be coming from out of state. Gregory had friends, colleagues, people who respected him. We can't just throw him in the ground." "No one said anything about throwing anyone anywhere," I said. I'm not spending $42,000. There are dignified options that don't cost that." Dennis cleared his throat. "We thought maybe you could put it on the Amex." I went very still. The Amex, the corporate card I'd gotten 3 years ago when I moved into a senior role and started managing vendor contracts. A card with a $50,000 limit that I used strictly for business expenses and paid off in full every month. A card that Gregory had apparently mentioned to his family at some point, framed, I imagined, as some evidence of our collective prosperity. "How do you know about that card?" I asked. "Gregory mentioned it," Kara said. "He said you had a card with a huge limit, that it could cover something like this easily." I looked at the 3 of them. My mother-in-law, with her wet eyes and her set jaw, Dennis with his hands folded like a man who thought this was already settled, Kara checking her nails. "That's a corporate card," I said. "I can't use it for personal expenses. It's not my money, but you have access to it," Dennis said. "Having access to something doesn't mean it belongs to me. Using it for a personal funeral would be fraud. My employer could terminate me and press charges." My mother-in-law threw her hands up. "Then use your own money." "You have savings." "I'm aware of what I have," I said, "and I'm going to use it carefully because I am now a single-income household, and my husband's estate, as far as I can tell, has more debts than assets." That landed. Dennis blinked. My mother-in-law's chin wobbled. What are you saying? She asked. I'm saying I'll arrange a respectful, appropriate service. I'm saying I won't be using the corporate card because I'm not committing fraud, and I'm saying that conversation is over. I picked up my coffee cup and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall for a long time. At some point, I picked up my phone and called my best friend, Trish. She'd been trying to reach me since the night I found out, and I'd been too numb to talk to anyone. But right then, I needed to hear a voice that was on my side. She answered on the first ring. I said, I need you to help me figure some things out. She said, I'll be there in an hour. Trish is an attorney, not a family law attorney. She does corporate contracts. But she's sharp and she knows who to call, and that night she sat at my kitchen island while my in-laws slept in my guest rooms, and she helped me start pulling threads. The first thing we found was the credit card statement I hadn't looked at because I'd been too overwhelmed. Gregory had a credit card I wasn't on. 3 of them, actually. Combined balance, just over $28,000. The charges told a story I didn't need a detective to decode. Restaurants I'd never been to, a weekend in Seattle I hadn't gone on, a jewelry purchase from a boutique downtown for $840 in March. March, our anniversary, is in April. The second thing we found was a loan. Gregory had taken out a personal loan 18 months ago, $11,000, and I'd had no idea. The payments had been coming out of his personal account, the one he kept separate, which I had never questioned because I'd respected his financial autonomy even while quietly covering most of our shared expenses. The third thing was the house. Our house is in my name, only my name. We'd bought it 4 years ago with money I'd saved before we got married, and the mortgage broker had recommended keeping it in a single name to simplify the financing given the income disparity at the time. Gregory had agreed without much fuss, and we'd both signed the paperwork, and I'd never thought about it much since. It was our home. That's how I thought of it. But it was my house. Legally, entirely, without question. Trish looked at me across the counter. You know what this means? I do, I said. My mother-in-law appeared in the kitchen doorway the next morning while I was making coffee, still in her robe, and announced that she'd been thinking and she believed it made the most sense for her to stay with me through the transition. Her words. Because she couldn't bear the thought of being alone right now, and she'd always been close to Gregory and she needed support. I poured my coffee. I thought about what I was going to say. Then I said it. I understand this is devastating for you. I'm going to help you get through the next few weeks. But I need to be honest with you. I won't be able to have you stay here long term. This is my house, and I'm going to be making some changes. She stared at me. Changes? I'm still working through the details, but I want you to know so you have time to make plans. Make plans, she repeated, her voice rising. My son just died. My son, and you're telling me to make plans? I'm telling you because I respect you enough not to surprise you, I said. I'm not asking you to leave today, but I need you to understand that I'm not in a position to support extended family indefinitely. She started crying. I handed her the box of tissues from the counter. Then I picked up my coffee and went to my home office and closed the door. I called my HR department and reported the Amex conversation. I know that sounds cold, but I knew there was a chance someone might try to use the card number Gregory had apparently shared around, or pressure me in ways that could put me in a compromised position at work. I needed a paper trail. My HR manager was understanding. She flagged it with our finance department and noted that I'd proactively reported the situation. The card stayed open and active for my legitimate business use. I spent the next week doing 2 things simultaneously: arranging a funeral that was dignified and affordable, and untangling the financial reality of my marriage. The funeral was a graveside service at a cemetery in southeast Portland, followed by a small reception at a restaurant that Gregory had actually loved, a neighborhood Italian place that let us use their private room on a Tuesday afternoon. It cost me just under $6,000 total. It was simple, it was real. People who had actually known my husband came and said things about him that were true, and some of them were genuinely lovely. And I cried for the first time since the hospital parking garage because in that room I could remember for a moment who he had been before I knew what he'd been doing. Dennis was furious about the service. He pulled me aside after the reception and said it was embarrassing, that people had expected more, that Gregory had deserved better. I let him finish. Then I said, "The service is done, Dennis. We're not revisiting it." "You had the money," he said. "You chose to do the bare minimum. I chose to do something I could afford without compromising my financial stability. My husband left me with significant debt and no life insurance payout yet. What I chose was survival." He didn't have an answer for that. The life insurance was a separate battle entirely, and I'll tell you about it because it matters. Gregory had a term life policy through his employer. I was the named beneficiary. The payout was $120,000, which sounds like a lot, but his outstanding personal debt, the credit cards, the personal loan, a second credit card I found later, totaled just over $36,000. His estate technically owed that, but as his spouse, I had to navigate some of it carefully with the help of a probate attorney Trish referred me to. My mother-in-law asked me 3 separate times, in 3 separate conversations, whether the family would receive anything from the life insurance. 3 times I told her that I was the named beneficiary and that I was using the funds to pay Gregory's debts and stabilize my finances. 3 times she implied that the moral thing to do would be to share it. After the 3rd conversation, I sat down and did something I should have done much earlier. I made a list of every dollar I had contributed to this family's well-being over 7 years of marriage. The mortgage payments, the grocery bills, the weekend I'd quietly paid for Dennis and Kara to come visit because they couldn't afford it right then. The times I'd transferred money to the joint account because Gregory's run dry. The car repair for my father-in-law's truck that no one had ever asked me about, they'd just told me what it cost. I totaled it up. I stopped at $312,000 because my hand was cramping and I still wasn't at the end of the list. I did not share that list with anyone. I just needed to see it. 3 weeks after the funeral, I listed the house. I hadn't made any dramatic announcements. I'd given my mother-in-law and father-in-law a written 30-day notice, very calm, very formal, outlining the date they needed to be out and my willingness to help them identify temporary housing options. I'd helped my father-in-law look at a senior apartment complex 2 miles from Dennis that had immediate availability and was within his Social Security budget. I had offered to cover his first month's rent. He had thanked me quietly and accepted. He was, as I said, a kind man. My mother-in-law had not accepted anything quietly. She'd called every relative I'd ever met. She'd left a voicemail for my own mother, which was a choice. She'd cried to our neighbours. She'd told anyone who would listen that I was throwing her out of her dead son's home. Her dead son's home. That framing. I responded to none of it publicly. My attorney sent a brief, polite letter clarifying the legal ownership of the property and the timeline of the 30-day notice. That was all. The house went under contract in 11 days. Portland real estate moves fast when you price correctly, and I had priced correctly because I'd done my research and I wasn't emotional about it. Not anymore. The sale netted me enough after paying off the mortgage and the outstanding estate debts to give me a genuinely clean slate. What nobody in my husband's family knew, what I hadn't told a single person outside of Trish, was that I'd had a separate savings account since before I got married. My grandmother had left me a small inheritance when I was 26, and instead of putting it toward anything joint, I'd kept it in a high-yield savings account at a credit union that wasn't connected to any of our shared banking. I'd added to it quietly over the years, not because I was planning to leave my marriage, but because my grandmother had taught me that a woman should always have something that is only hers. Some money that doesn't belong to the marriage, doesn't belong to the household, belongs only to her. I had called that account my mad money account when I thought about it, which wasn't often. Now I thought about it a lot. The month after the house closed, I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood I'd always loved, but we'd never lived in because Gregory had wanted more space, more yard, more status markers. The apartment had a small balcony where I could see a slice of Mount Hood on clear days. I bought new furniture, Not replacement furniture, genuinely new choices that were mine alone. A couch in a blue-green colour I'd always wanted. Bookshelves that were only full of books I'd chosen. A kitchen that stayed clean exactly as long as I kept it clean, with no evidence of anyone else's habits creeping in. I didn't hear from my mother-in-law for 6 weeks. Then she called and she was calmer and she asked if we could have coffee. I said yes. We met at a place near her new apartment. She'd found a room to rent through someone at her church, and she looked tired but steadier. We talked for an hour. She said things she hadn't been able to say before, about Gregory, about the years before I knew him, about the kind of boy he'd been, and what she'd hoped his life would look like. I listened. It was real grief, and I took it seriously. She never apologised for the Amex conversation, or for the funeral argument, or for the voicemail to my mother. Maybe she didn't think those things required an apology. Maybe someday she'll see it differently. I'm not holding my breath, but I'm also not holding a grudge. Grudges are heavy, and I'm travelling light now. The woman from the apartment on SE Belmont sent me a message through Instagram approximately 2 months after Gregory died. I stared at it for a long time. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known he was married, and then she said he had told her we were separated, and then she said she knew that wasn't enough, and she was sorry. I read it 3 times. I thought about what I wanted to say back. Then I closed the app and never responded because there was nothing I needed from her and nothing I had to give her. And the conversation could only ever make me feel worse than I already did. What I did do, and I want to be clear that this felt important to me, was go back to the Italian restaurant where we'd held the reception and have dinner there alone on a Friday night 3 months after Gregory died. I sat at a table for 2 and I ordered the thing I always wanted to order but never did because he didn't like that dish, and I had a glass of wine and I ate slowly and looked out the window at the street. The waiter asked if I was waiting for someone and I said no, just me tonight, and he smiled and refilled my water and left me alone. Just me tonight. That sentence, I realised, had stopped being a sad sentence somewhere along the way. I'm not sure exactly when it happened. Sometime between the house sale and the new couch, I think. Somewhere in the middle of relearning what my own preferences were, what I liked for breakfast, which direction I slept, how I wanted to spend a Sunday. I have a friend at work who has been gently suggesting for months that I should start dating, that I'm young, that I'm wasting my 30s, and I appreciate that she means well. I'm not ready. Maybe I'll never be in the way she means. But I'm not hiding from it either. I'm just in no hurry, because for the first time in 7 years, my time is entirely my own. And that turns out to be something I need to sit with for a while before I hand any of it to someone else. Last month, I got a promotion. Senior Director, the kind of title I'd been working toward for 3 years and had put on the back burner twice because the timing wasn't right with our lives, our plans, Gregory's deals that needed support and attention. I accepted it the same day it was offered. I had dinner with Trish to celebrate, and she ordered a bottle of champagne. Real champagne, and I said, "Isn't this too much?" And she said, "Absolutely not," and she was right. We sat there for 3 hours and talked about everything. The past year, the things I'd handled, the things I wished I'd done differently, the things I was looking forward to that I hadn't even known I was allowed to look forward to. Walking back to my car that night, I passed a bridal shop with a display in the window. All that white and lace and carefully arranged hope. I stopped in front of it for a second. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel bitter. I felt something more like neutral, like passing a landmark you used to attach significance to and realizing the significance has quietly drained away, and what's left is just a window, just a display, just a thing in the world that doesn't belong to your story anymore. I kept walking. The Mount Hood was out the next morning when I woke up. One of those clear November days when the whole mountain looks like it's been placed there deliberately, like a painting someone hung on the horizon. I made coffee and stood on my balcony and looked at it for a long time. My phone was inside. The lasagna was a year ago. The life I'm building is small right now, apartment-sized, and mine in every corner of it. And on mornings like that one, that feels like exactly enough.